on geographical determinism. What that means roughly is that much of our life as individuals or our life as countries or civilizations is determined by geography. A famous example, and one of the great theorists of this, is Montesquieu, and he, in certain passages, related to the differences between southern Europe, the olive and vine areas of the Mediterranean, and northern Europe, the hard grains, beer, cheese sort of areas of northern Europe. And he said that the differences in their character, the fact that the south is Catholic and of a certain temperament and so on, and the north is different, is related to their geography. It obviously comes mediated through things. So there's the soil, the sun, the rocks, all those things. They don't directly affect people, but they lead you to grow certain crops and live in certain ways, and therefore the character of the civilizations is different. He didn't actually, although he's accused of it, say it absolutely determined it, because all sorts of other variables come in, but it was a strong pressure. And it's an idea which is, I find, helpful if you take it in a wider sense of being a background strong feature. To take an example I've often thought about is the difference between Eastern Asian civilizations, which are based on, particularly China, Japan, and parts of India, on rice cultivating civilizations which arise out of a certain ecology, and the hard grain civilizations of Western Europe and so on. And just that difference leads to differences in your population patterns, your trading patterns, your diet, your social structure, your political system, and you can read off huge differences in civilizations like that. Or again, another favourite example was Mark Bloch, who, rather similarly to Montesquieu, said that southern Europe, with its light soils, meant that you could use a very light plough, which you could turn very easily, and just scratch a scratch plough, or even hoeing. And that led to a certain pattern of settlements, which led to a certain social structure, whereas in northern Europe you could only break the ground with a heavy plough using oxen or horses, and ploughing in long strips, and that led to a different field shapes and so on. So he made a sort of line across central France, which I call the Mark Bloch line, and you have different civilizations there. Another theory which I don't subscribe to, but is interesting, was the idea of hydraulic civilizations, where in China and elsewhere you had huge water supplies, vast rivers, flooding, and you therefore had to control these elemental forces of water, and so you had to mobilize people on a large scale into building dams and controlling the water, and that led to authoritarian countries. And that theory was meant to explain why you had authoritarian dictatorships. It was applied as well to Russia, which seemed very implausible since it's not a hydraulic civilization, but still it was an interesting idea. And the last example, which I really do find very helpful, is the determinism of islands. I've talked about this in terms of islands before, but basically that living on an island can have a very large effect. A big island like Britain or Japan, relatively big, and you're surrounded by a sea, and this protects you against enemies, and this leads to a certain political structure and feudalism and so on. Of course, it's not determining, because you have other biggish islands, Madagascar and so on, which don't lead in that direction. So geographical determinism is like all kinds of determinism, good in parts or good to a certain extent, but there are always exceptions which show that there are intervening variables between the thing that determines and the thing that is determined, which you have to take into account. So you can say, all things being equal, an island will lead to this, but things very often are not equal. And so it's a very interesting historical tool to make a start with. But the counterexample, which I can end with, is given by, for example, de Tocqueville, when he went to the outback of Canada. And here you had a very tough and particular environment and geography. And he went to a remote settlement which had been settled by two different groups, the English and the French. And he'd thought, well, they're faced with this kind of environment, they will, over a century or so, have become pretty similar. But he was astonished to find that the differences, as he said, between the French and the English were as great as they were between wherever it was in France, the Loire Valley and the Thames Valley, as if they were in those areas. In other words, the culture and the customs they brought with us had completely dominated the environment, and so they never spoke to each other. They lived on opposite sides of the streets, but they kept to themselves, and their culture and customs were totally different. So the environment had hardly changed them. And I observed this, I suppose, in my own experience in India and elsewhere, and looking at the British Empire. The British, wherever they went, were hardly shaped by their environment. They went on plodding around as if they were living in Bournemouth or Clacton or wherever it was they came from. And perhaps that is one of the things that gave rise to that wry comment of supposedly the Indians, mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun, and the English hadn't even noticed that it might be a good idea to keep indoors in the heat of the day. They just went on as if they were wandering around the Suffolk coast. So it's a fascinating area to explore within limits.